Let's talk a little bit about, I could say, tension. Tension has a negative connotation. We could say fault lines in West Adams between different peoples, income levels, ethnicities, things of that nature. I bring this up, comes to mind because of Western Heights. Now, Western Heights is the neighborhood that abuts Kinney Heights. You can imagine the intermixing of neighborhoods, and then in the 1950s, the 10 just barrels through and divides them. So Western Heights, the southern border, is the 10 freeway, the Santa Monica Freeway, and the north of it is Washington Boulevard, which is one of the main thoroughfares from west to east in the West Adams district. Western Heights, almost all beautiful California craftsman homes. When you think of a craftsman home, think of the rejection of all the little brouhaha, all the little bits of business of Victorian, all the Rococo, the Beaux Arts. Think of a rejection of all of that, all those things that signified status and wealth, position and power, a rejection of that, and a elevation of natural materials, of the material, of compositions. We think of like exposed beams. You think of this as a harbinger or a pointer towards anticipation of modernism. In modernism, you think of those 1920s, the glass and steel skyscrapers that show you, look, here's how the building is made. Look at these steel beams. Thinking of Walter Gropius and the Bauhaus movement and all those guys. Mies van der Rohe, stripping away from that which hides it or tries to give you a narrative of wealth or power. We're going to strip all that away. And so we can see anticipation of that. We can see the California craftsman. We can see the craftsman as stripping all that away, just showing the simple exposed beams and beautiful composition. And maybe there may have been at some level a practical nature or pragmatic nature to this as well as the artisans themselves, the people that did things like the amazing Guasti Mansion or did all the murals and things of that nature in the Clark Library, as their wages went up, right, in the 20th century. So maybe it was more expensive, and so that kind of fit in. One can imagine into the what we call the California craftsman movement. Now, the majority of the craftsman homes in Western Heights have their exteriors intact. It might be different paint jobs, different colors, things of that nature, but you do get a sense of how they must have been when they were built. But that's the exteriors. The interiors are a different matter. And here's the thing, depending upon where you are in West Adams, some of the interiors will really be preserved. You go to Victoria Park, also known as Victoria Circle. You'll see that in an upcoming chapter, where you've got these amazing interiors, and they're all preserved. But in other areas like Western Heights, they're not. And, everybody has their theories about this. I've been told by several people, well, when, they had the white flight, and then when the folks moved in, different folks like black folks moved in, racial covenants were overturned. Well, they didn't necessarily have the money to remodel. So you had the interiors preserved. And then when other folks came in, decades later in the 70s and 80s, you had those homes preserved, though sometimes families would strip out the fixtures, the stained glass and the other stuff, in order to sell and to make some money on them. So that's one theory. I wanted to show different examples of this in Western Heights, and so you'll see the inside of, for instance, 3 homes. We've got one that's really preserved, one that's had been totally stripped out, and then one that's kind of in the middle, and how the owners deal with this. Now, you have a home that's totally preserved, craftsman home, that's owned by Don Lynch, who's a local writer and historian, and he was somebody that a priori wanted to find a home like this and came into West Adams. Though he had family historically there, came into West Adams to find his sort of dream home as someone who was an aficionado of that time period. In fact, that's why you'll see a poster for the Titanic in the kitchen shot in his home, and also as a painting of the Titanic in his living room, because he's one of the world's leading authorities in the Titanic, the ship and the terrible disaster. In fact, James Cameron, who made the film Titanic, used Don's work as a primary source, and Don even has a cameo in the film if you look closely. So Don wanted to, I had a very strong long list of requirements for the kind of home he wanted, and he got everything he wanted, except I don't think it didn't have the butler's pantry. He wanted a butler's pantry that he wanted. But you'll see in the photograph of the kitchen, for instance, you'll see a stairway, sort of a back stairway, which will allow maids, butlers, what have you, to be able to go in and out without interrupting the main flow. So think of it as a small-time Downton Abbey kind of a thing, where you would entertain your guests in the living room or the dining room, and there was a back staircase that would allow the servants to go in and out, and that's a very, very common feature. here in West Adams. So that's a home that was preserved, and Don has furnished it with period-specific furniture, right? So you got the Craftsman furniture, what have you. Now, on the other hand, you've got something totally different in Dan Hake's home, where the place was just gutted, and there maybe is one piece of stained glass left, one stained glass fixture left, and everything has been taken away, and he's going to have to do something. Whether or not he's going to restore it fully, I don't know, but you'll see what the previous owner had done, and let's not judge. Let's have a judge-free zone here. You need to have a space for everything. But when you look at that photo, dear viewer, when you look at the photo of Dan Hake's, what happened to the attic, don't look at the photo for too long. Don't stare, because I think you might get a cocaine contact high from all those mirrored surfaces. It was a different time. We didn't know then what we know now. But anyway, so that's an example of someone just going in and doing something totally different that seems incongruous to our eyes, and Dan's going to have to figure something out there. Then there's another home. A young couple has just moved into West Adams, moved into Western Heights, and you can see their home that closes this chapter. And the home is relatively intact, but their solution for living there is a common one here, in which if the home is intact, it's not perfect by any means, but let the home be the home, and don't clutter it up with bric-a-brac and stuff. Just let yourself and your friends and your guests just see it for what it is. See the exposed beams, see the hutch, and don't clutter it, and just enjoy the craftsmanship that went into it. I'm thinking about Don Lynch and how he's as I mentioned, a local writer, local historian. In fact, he's one of the authors of this book on the images of America, West Adams, which I mentioned and showed in the introduction. And if you're into the stories of West Adams, you should get this. It's chock full of stuff. For instance, there's the tale of the old white lady in her 80s in Western Heights who wanted to pass along her home to her friend, her young black chauffeur. But my problems with that in those days, so she had to marry her young black chauffeur, and the family and the state tried to have her declared legally insane. But she won, and that happened. And actually, now that I think about it, I'm not 100% sure that story is in here, but it is chock-a-block full of great stuff about West Adams. I would recommend it. You can find a link to it in the further reading section in this volume. But I mentioned, Don, I think about the historians. I think about how do we record the history of West Adams? And there's a reason why almost all the links, probably 90% of the links in this volume, are to Wikipedia rather than other sites which are dedicated to West Adams. And there's a reason for that, and I find that everybody's got different opinions about what happened in West Adams, or even what parts of West Adams are called. But with Wikipedia, even though specific entries in Wikipedia might be inaccurate, it tends towards accuracy over time. So think of like a pendulum swinging, and it slowly gets closer and closer to the center. In my experience, whenever I've read a Wikipedia article and it's inaccurate, and I revisit it every couple months or what have you, it'll tend towards accuracy over time as people who know about the subject go and edit it and debate amongst themselves, and then eventually gets towards accuracy, even though there are there will be inaccurate bits of business. And for instance, in the West Adams the entry in Wikipedia right now, as of the time I'm recording this, as of late January 2014, the entry for the West Adams District in Wikipedia lists some of the great National Historic Monuments that we have here. But the map that it shows for where West Adams is for a completely different part of LA. It's not West Adams, it's a whole different part of LA. It does not even correspond to their own list. So it's inaccurate, and maybe it'll be accurate by the time you, dear viewer, watch this. But I'm linking towards Wikipedia again because I find that it tends towards accuracy over time. One other thing I want to mention is you'll hear talked about a couple times in this chapter, the racial covenants in the neighborhood in Western Heights, because in America at the time, you go back a century, throughout all of America, you'll find written into the deeds of homes, if you want to buy or sell a home in the area, it'll be written into the deed that you couldn't sell to a Jew, or you couldn't sell to black folk, what have you. And this was the case for West Adams. And as you'll hear in one of the oral histories, there was a case brought by the Shiflets and others that was instrumental in overturning the racial covenants. So West Adams was instrumental in the history of the U.S. in overturning those racial covenants. The case went all the way to either the state Supreme Court or the U.S. Supreme Court. I'm not sure which right now, but hey, Wikipedia. And so there's a history of that in West Adams, that sort of battling against the terrible injustice of bigotry that we have here in this country was founded on. It's one of the reasons that overturning of the racial covenants is one of the reasons why, West Adams was that, as I mentioned in the introduction, the center, the locus. So if I didn't mention the introduction, mentioned it in the chapter on the 10, the center of black political, cultural, and economic power in the United States, in Los Angeles, and we still have echoes of that today. This is why, for instance, Marvin Gaye's The Family Home is in Western Heights, or Ray Charles' studio is in Harvard Heights, for instance. This is not a photograph of it, but you can see it in the background of the introduction. When I turn the corner, and there's that building which has got greenery growing on the side. And that's Ray Charles' studio, and you can actually go inside. It's a museum dedicated to Mr. Charles. And the Marvin Gaye family home has got this beautiful. It's a Tudor home, and it's got the beautiful greenery around it. And that is also one of the subject of this book, I think, is how greenery has intertwined. The greenery of Southern California, the flora of Southern California is intertwined with the buildings. If you look back at how these homes were back in the day, look at the photograph, for instance, of Victoria Park or Victoria Circle in that chapter back in the day from the air, and you'll see all the palm trees are short and stubby, and now they're so tall. This has become unintentionally, you do any project and things will make themselves apparent. This was unintentionally one of the subjects of this book, is how the flora has intermingled with and accentuates and brackets the architecture of West Adams, which is why I include the photograph of a Frank Tyler apartment building. You might look at the building and say, well, that doesn't look, whatever, it's just nothing extraordinary about that building, but look at the floor in front of it. Look at the explosion of greenery and how that affects the experience of the apartment building. Or look at that ficus which is bursting out of the tree in front of the Craftsman home elsewhere in the chapter. That is another one of the stories for me of West Adams.